humans. Welcome back to the Legal Trans Woman on AM 950 and WCPT 820 in Chicago. Our show, we advocate, yours truly, Ellie Krug, I advocate for trans and gender variant humans, and as well, I try to do my best to normalize our community while bridging the divide with those who are afraid or uncertain about us. Okay, I mean, I am fiercely advocating, okay? I am, but I'm also, look, come on, we can have a conversation. Give me a chance to let you know what it means to be transgender. Maybe you'll even understand some more, and maybe you might even like me. Okay. All right, enough about that. Once more, we have a great show. For the big interview, we're having Evan Urquhart back from Assigned Media. He's going to come back and talk about how the New York Times has been covering the trans community and trans-related stories. It'll be very interesting for you. And of course, we will have our, as we always do, our news bites and our random acts. But let's begin with this week's big story. And it involves one of the world's most famous and richest authors, who is virulently, 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 anti-transgender. I'm speaking of the famed JK Rowling, author of all those Harry Potter books, she is a billionaire because of those books. She has sold more than 600 million Harry Potter series books. Okay, I mean, that is like unbelievable. And while the Harry Potter book series promotes a message of inclusion, it does, of those who are other, because Harry, you may recall, was considered other. Okay, he was marginalized, at Hogwarts, and then he was part of a group of other people who had been marginalized. Okay, so her books promote this message about being inclusive, about accepting all people. But in real life, J.K. Rowling has been quite the opposite relative to transgender people. She has repeatedly spoken out against trans women accessing cisgender women's spaces, as well as she has opposed gender-affirming care for trans youth and even the use of preferred pronouns. She is a leader of what is known as the TERF, T-E-R-F movement. TERF stands for Transgender Exclusionary Radical Feminists. Okay, these are women who believe that transgender women, A, are not real, and B, should not be allowed in any kind of space where cisgender women access. Now, J.K. Rowling's transphobia has been growing on for close to a decade. And as reported by S-Bomb on the Aaron in the Morning blog this week, J.K. Rowling's transphobia again reared its ugly head. It involved Amnesty International, the world-famous organization calling out against torture, calling out for human rights across the board in a variety of ways across the world. This controversy involves Amnesty International, which issued earlier this week a list, or maybe it was the end of last week, a list of, quote, anti-rights organizations in the UK. Amnesty International, if I remember correctly, is based in the UK. And it puts out actually an annual list of groups that are anti-rights. But apparently this year, Amnesty International issued its report, which included groups that are labeled as gender critical groups. That is, organizations like nonprofits, other organizations that oppose transgender people or their inclusion in society. On the list of anti-trans groups that Amnesty International put out was a women's shelter that J.K. Rowling founded, named Bera's Place. It's in Scotland, okay? And she founded that place because she had been working with a women's shelter in Scotland. That the director of that women's shelter was a transgender woman. Apparently that upset JK Rowling greatly, and she decided to go launch her own women's shelter in the UK. And in keeping with JK Rowling's transphobia, her shelter bans transgender women from accessing the facility or its services. Also on Amnesty International's list were the UK's Gay Men's Network, which has advocated for policies detrimental to trans people. There are also several other groups on the list, including one named GenSpect, GenSpect, which the Southern Poverty Law Center has listed as a hate group. Okay, so Amnesty International is doing its thing. It's calling out organizations that are affecting detrimentally the human rights of transgender people. I mean, Amnesty International is doing what it's supposed to do. Now, the thing to know about this controversy is that in the UK, as it relates to libel and defamation law, that it is far less aligned with free speech, their laws, far less aligned with free speech principles, and it makes it easier to sue the alleged defamer or libeling party. JK Rowling knows this, okay? And apart from demanding that her shelter be removed from Amnesty International's list of groups that marginalize transgender people, JK Rowling went out on public on X and issued a statement that offered to fund the legal expenses of any other women's organization identified on the Amnesty International list. Now, Amnesty International's list of anti-trans groups, groups marginalizing transgender people, I think it had 100 different groups on there, okay? I mean, they went through about trying to protect trans people and calling out that those that don't. So JK Rowling comes out on X and says, if your group is on this list, me, the billionaire, would help fund you to go sue Amnesty International for defamation, or however you want to put it. In other words, a very public anti-trans billionaire is willing to sue Amnesty International into oblivion, okay? Simply because Amnesty International is trying to protect transgender and gender variant humans. In response to JK Rowling's threats, I'm a little disappointed in Amnesty International about this because the group, Amnesty International, pulled its report. It took it down off of its website. It caved. It caved to JK Rowling. It then issued a statement stating that the report and list, okay, were made public, quote, without going through the established internal review process, and then went on to say that, quote, the language in the report does not reflect the position of Amnesty International, unquote. So in other words, Amnesty International is walking it all back, all of it, in order to avoid being sued in a multitude of lawsuits that JK Rowling will fund. In addition, Amnesty International self-reported to the UK's government entity that oversees the country's nonprofits, okay? And so apparently, there's this governmental entity that makes sure that nonprofits are doing what they're supposed to do, and Amnesty International self-reported and said, well, it looks like we've got an issue here. Okay, they're just trying to cover their tracks. I don't know if there will be actual lawsuits funded by JK Rowling, okay? And if there are, I will let you know, okay? But what I do know is that the TERF movement, transgender, exclusionary, radical feminist movement, as led by JK Rowling, has scored a significant victory at further diminishing the rights of transgender people, not only in the UK, but by extension in the world at large. JK Rowling has this enormous following. There are people that hang on the edge of their seats to hear what she has to say about various things. There are people that are absolutely in love with her books, and from a writing standpoint, she's an excellent writer, okay? I'm going to give her that due. But you can't write stories. You can't put together stories about the inclusion of those who are other in those stories. And then in public, in your public life, be so free as to exclude, marginalize, demean, lessen a particular group of people, transgender women. So, dear listeners, you can make a choice here. You can. I know that there are a lot of people that love Harry Potter, and I know that in many families it's kind of a rite of passage. You get the Harry Potter book, you get the series, because you read it as a kid, you know about this book and all the characters, and now you have something in common with this younger person in your life. You can make this choice not to buy the books, because I guarantee you, for every book you buy that JK Rowling has written, every book is being used. The money from that is being used against my community, our community. So you get to make that choice. There are a whole lot of other books out there for young people and for yourself. Okay? So please make the right choice. You're listening to me, Ellie Krug, on The Illegal Trans Woman. We're going to take a break. When we come back, we're going to speak with Evan Urquhart about the New York Times. You're listening to me, Ellie Krug. If you like what you hear, visit my website, elliekrug.com. Email me at elliejkrug@gmail.com. We'll be back in a second. And we're back. Ellie Krug with The Illegal Trans Woman, and now is the time for the big interview, and I am thrilled to have Evan Urquhart back from Assigned Media, Trans Spyglass, who we've had on the show several times now, and even like last month, but I wanted to have Evan back because he penned a great piece titled "The New York Times Wrote 5 Stories on the Trans Athlete Ban Decision. Not one quote from a transgender person. Not one quoted a transgender person. Thank you. I'm sorry about that. Evan, welcome back to The Illegal Trans Woman. I'm thrilled to have you here.
I'm absolutely thrilled to be back. Thank you.
I'm thrilled to have you again. So, Evan, this piece dropped, of course, in the wake, and my listeners are very aware of how despondent I am over what the Supreme Court has done with our trans athletes, although you and I both knew how that was going to come down. But they're aware of that. And then, I saw this piece about the influential New York Times. I'm going to let you talk about its reach. Really the way it's skewing its reporting as it relates to trans people. So let's begin. Let's ground everybody. Tell us about the New York Times. Tell us about how influential, impactful it is in terms of American media, print media, and social media, as well as the world.
Yeah, I mean, the New York Times is the newspaper that everyone who wants to be a print journalist wants to go to the New York Times, wants to work for the New York Times. And that certainly includes myself. I idolized the New York Times when I was coming into journalism. They employ the most journalists, I believe, of any newsroom in the country. I believe over 1,700 journalists. They have the most subscribers of a U.S. newspaper. And they've been, they've been owned by the same family, the Sulzberger family, or the Sulzberger-Ox family, since actually the late 1800s. So it's sort of a family-owned big business.
Dynasty.
Dynasty, yep. But the modern New York Times really goes back to these landmark Supreme Court cases in the 1960s and 70s that really kind of laid the foundation for press freedoms in the U.S., the Pentagon Papers and other related cases that really put limits on how much the government can control what newspapers publish, which is, I think, the foundation for how they're seen as this kind of believed to be liberal-leaning bastion of press freedom in the U.S.
So let's get to that word believed. And let's get to the theory about liberalism, the theory about free speech, and let's talk about 2026 America and what the Times is reflecting about how America is right now. And then let's dovetail into its reporting about trans people.
Yeah, I mean, I think that certainly seeing the New York Times as a liberal paper was perhaps always a little bit of a stretch. They're institutionalists, you know, they're a big business in a city that includes Wall Street. You know, they're not communists, and they never were. You know, certainly I think they maybe showed more concern for the poor at an earlier time, but they've always been institutionalists and very small c conservative in terms of the status quo is what the New York Times typically reflects back, and their readers are typically affluent, white, you know, people of business, serious people, politicians. So you could certainly always say that their reputation as sort of a liberal paper was maybe a little overblown, a little
right.
Yeah.
But I mean, but they are like the, you know, litmus test. You know, they're the touchstone for the press here in America.
Absolutely.
You know,
absolutely.
And so, and there was a time where the Times, as it related to trans people, the trans community, before the ascent of MAGA, before the ascent of Donald Trump, before the ascent of Russell Vought to Project 2025, where the Times was giving trans people, our community, its due. Am I wrong on that? I mean, that was certainly my sense.
Yeah, you're not wrong at all. I mean, I think that if you want to briefly kind of touch on sort of the roots of that, the New York Times way back in the 70s, I believe, was quite anti-gay, meaning anti-gay men, because that was really the part of the LGBTQ community that was at all visible at the time. And that underwent a change where the New York Times kind of began taking gay rights movements and AIDS activism seriously. And that stance towards, you know, gay people and lesbians sort of grandfathered in or kind of naturally led towards having a kind of open-minded, tolerant stance towards the trans community. And it is quite recently, only in the last 5 years or so, 5-6 years or so, that the stance towards gay men and lesbians has kind of maintained as very kind of open-minded and seeing tolerance as sort of the default, but their stance towards the transgender community has really changed quite drastically and become very kind of skeptical and hostile, and what we're about to talk to, which is excluding trans voices, trans people from the coverage itself.
Well, I mean, for a long time, I mean, Jennifer Finney Boylan, who at one time was the most famous, you know, visible trans writer out there, okay? I mean, that's no longer the case, but who was, all right? And her book, by the way, you know, She's Not There, was instrumental for me in helping me to come out. She was a regular columnist for the New York Times. She had a contract and all of the, you know, her opinion pieces were appearing with some regularity in the Times about the trans community. Of course, always favorable because she was a part of the community. And then they, was it this year or last year that they just didn't renew the contract for her?
I would have to check, but I think it was last year at the earliest. It might have been a couple of years ago.
Okay.
And she was a contributing writer, which is a little different from a columnist. A columnist writes every week. A contributing writer writes maybe once a month or so. But yeah, and I think also it's important to mention that, you know, M. Gesson is a current columnist who sometimes writes about trans issues and who is sort of a member of the community, is non-binary, and so it's not as if that perspective has completely gone from the opinion side of things.
Okay, all right. Well, that's great to know. I did not know that, and thanks for the clarification about columnist versus contributing writer.
Well, this is the thing about journalism is there's so many finicky
Yeah.
little rules and ethics and standards
Well,
that people just don't have any idea about.
and this is why we have you. This is why you recently were accorded a wonderful award from journalist profession. And so I just, so thank you. All right, let's get to the heart of your piece in assigned media. What the, I mean, certainly specifically about the trans athletes and about them doing the stories, but generally about how they're diluting our voice at this point. So go ahead.
Yeah, so I've been doing a news tracking project all year for 2026. So we're a little bit more than halfway through. And all I'm doing is sort of looking at every single mention of the word transgender and certain other kind of closely related keywords like gender identity in 10 US outlets. And so that's New York Times. Let me see, I have it somewhere. The New York Times, the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, the Associated Press, NPR, ABC, NBC, and CBS. And then also two kind of progressive outlets to kind of look at like a best case scenario. And that's Mother Jones and the 19th. And so for this most recent story, I looked at the coverage of just one story, which, as you mentioned at the opener, is the Supreme Court decision on the sports bans, state level sports bans, which was, upholding the right of states to ban trans people from sports. And when I looked at this coverage, there was something that really stood out, which was that the New York Times had produced the most stories of any US outlet in my tracker. They produced 5 stories where the sports ban was the primary focus of the story. And they covered trans people the least. So they did not quote a single trans person in any of these 5 stories. And just, I don't want to go through every single one, but, we have NPR wrote 4 stories and 2 of them covered trans people.
Thank you, NPR.
We have Washington Post wrote 3 stories and 3 of them quoted trans people. But, I want to be fair. It's very possible to have a straight news story that's kind of brief and just giving a bare bones. So the Associated Press wrote 1 story. They didn't quote a trans person. That seems perfectly normal. I believe the Wall Street Journal wrote 2 stories. They didn't quote a trans person. That again, it's not.
But that's the Wall Street Journal.
Well, but also, it's not remarkable to have a story or 2 and not get every quote you would want. It is remarkable to have 5 stories and not quote a member of the group who is subject to the ban even once.
Well, I mean, talk to me about journalistic standards. Okay, I mean, what does good professional journalism require? If you're going to write a story about a community, particularly, I mean, they knew the names of the 2, plaintiffs in the trans athlete cases, including, what is Becky Piper Jones? What is she? Just 15 years old, 16 years old, but boy, she can certainly hold her own on any interview. I've seen her.
She can, and they had interviewed her in the past, and if they had included a quote from an interview with her in the past, I would have given them credit for it.
Right.
I mean, I'm trying not to hold the New York Times or any of these organizations to an unreasonably high bar, but it is kind of a basic journalistic principle that you give voice to to anyone with a stake in the story, to any significant actor or significant side in the story. And the purpose of that is really about informing the audience and making sure that the audience understands all different angles of the story. And it's related to this idea of journalistic activity or unbiased journalism, which is something that's actually very contentious among journalists because no human being can be completely without bias. And when we say unbiased, often we mean, a sort of white middle-class male perspective that seems neutral,
Right,
but, but the core of, I think, wanting to be unbiased is a very good and important one, which is the audience should be hearing all sides of the story. You shouldn't be putting your thumb on the scales and saying, this is who you listen to, this is who you don't listen to. You're giving them all the information they need to understand the full kind of picture of the situation.
But if you're writing a story about trans people and about the impact of this fundamental Supreme Court decision, which combined both of the cases, you would think that you would want to hear from some trans person that is affected by that, or at least from a trans person about what it means to be transgender, and to hear, even if you're not the athlete, to hear, this coming down and what kind of psychological impact does that have on you. And I mean, I don't think that writing that would be in any way biased. I think it would be helping to inform from a humanistic standpoint what it means to be transgender, with the government and the courts literally targeting you.
Absolutely. I mean, I think that certainly for the trans community, it's very important for us to feel like we are being heard, that we have the ability to reach the American public at a time when, our rights are kind of moving backwards and being taken away. But from a journalistic standpoint, when you're thinking about the audience as a whole, it's also very important for that audience member to be able to hear that perspective. And in the case of a trans, sports story, I think ideally hearing from a trans athlete, which most of these outlets that included a trans person had at least some sort of quote from a trans person who was interested in playing sports, a young trans person who wanted to play sports. Chris Mosier, I think, was interviewed by NPR. That is a trans man who has participated in men's sports. It can be difficult to get the exact interview you want, and these plaintiffs were very young. It's understandable if they weren't being made available to be interviewed by every single news outlet, but there are certainly ways to bring that perspective forward, including, as I said, just quoting from a past time when you interviewed that athlete, which for the New York Times is very easy. For many media outlets, you maybe didn't get that interview, but for the New York Times, you just drop that quote in. It wouldn't be difficult.
Well, so there's a difference between being sloppy, okay, and about having an anti-trans bias by a major, newspaper. And you've written in the past, I mean, back in early 25, you wrote about New York Times bias and about how it refused to essentially carry forward with a trans journalist that it had on its staff. And so what do you think here? Was this sloppiness, or was this more of for me, as the outsider, the non-professional journalist, not even the journalist, okay? For me, from the outside, it looks like the Times is trying to be compliant and to not make waves relative to the Trump administration, relative to MAGA, relative to, all the powers that could in some way make the Times life difficult. That's my impression from the outside. Give me your take to the extent that you're comfortable doing that.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's certainly what I have felt or sensed about the coverage, which going back quite a long time now, it felt like there was a change. And, I'm a reporter, but I have, opinions and intuitions like anyone else. So you wouldn't report, I kind of feel like there's a change. I've also done reporting, as have others, about this question. And it's actually Amara Jones of Translash, who's an amazing trans reporter, who I think got the most in terms of going behind the scenes and sort of understanding that the current publisher of the New York Times, who's a guy named A.G. Sulzberger, really felt embarrassed by the New York Times' reputation as a quote unquote liberal rag. And he really sort of wanted to change that reputation. And there is not, I think, a smoking gun in terms of he wanted to change that reputation by changing the trans coverage, but that is the time frame.
Sure.
So we know that he wanted to change that reputation, and we know that the trans coverage changed. We also know that he was very upset. There's other reporting. He was very upset that Joe Biden wouldn't give him the kind of interview he felt the New York Times was entitled to. So there was sort of beef with specifically A.G. Sulzberger and the previous president, which I think is interesting.
Yeah, for sure. Well, let's talk about, though, and we've got a couple minutes still. Let's talk about what impact this has on our community when we're either ignored, all right, or, portrayed in some light, and it doesn't have to be necessarily negative, but in some light. For example, with the trans athletes, well, but there's a cisgender girl that doesn't get to be on the team because the that's right out of Brett Kavanaugh's reasoning with the girls valuing their medals and little statuettes in their rooms, so someday when they come back from college or when they're married, they can go into their room and see those things and feel good. I mean, what is the impact about us not getting positive review or getting any review at all?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that the average member of the American public really does not understand the breadth and the depth of the rollback of human rights that has happened for the trans community. I think this is a story that has been undercovered. Now, to give some fairness to other reporters, I think there's been certainly a lot going on in the world. The Trump administration is a circus with a new distraction every day, every week. So some of it is that, but some of it I think is the New York Times in particular, as the largest outlet with the most subscribers, also having the most coverage of trans issues and taking this stance, which is leaving out trans voices much more so than other comparable outlets while covering trans stories more. And that's a pattern that I've seen kind of throughout this time doing the tracker, where this story was kind of a microcosm, but I have seen that they have the most coverage and the least quoting of trans people in their stories, sort of really across the board. Like, that's a very consistent pattern.
Well, and my take on what's going on with our community is that it's almost impossible to normalize us, and that's the thing that we need. We just need people to think that they, if you've never met a trans person, okay, at least knowingly, at least that you can read about what a trans person has to say about what the experience means to be trans, because unless we're normalized, unless people come to see us as humans, and maybe as even likable, unless that happens, okay, it's going to make it a whole lot easier just to erase us. It really is. And of course, I think that's the goal of the Trump administration.
Yeah, I do. I think that, from a journalistic perspective, it is not a sign of bias to think that trans people are equal to every other person and deserve as many rights as anyone else. Like, that, I think, is a perfectly neutral thing for a journalist to believe. I consider myself an unbiased journalist, and I believe that very strongly. But I do think that that non-trans people are really kind of missing those perspectives and not getting that story, both of who we are, but also of what's happening to us. Which I know you kind of bring to people on your show, and which is so valuable that you do this work.
Oh, thanks. I really appreciate that. Well, listen, Evan, I'm watching our time. We'll have you back on again for sure, okay? But I want to just, as I think I've said last time, but I'm going to say it again now, please keep up the work. You are, I know that you're trying to elevate assigned media, and listeners, all they have to do is Google assigned media. Is that right? And they'll be able to find your blog. They'll be able to find the website. They can contribute.
Assignedmedia.org.
Right. And they can contribute if they want to. There's a way to do that. And it's independent journalism, and we just need it more and more. So, Evan, thanks for being again on The Illegal Trans Woman.
Thank you so much. It's always a pleasure.
Okay, thanks. All right, listeners. Well, that's Evan Urquhart, who is the owner, curator of Assigned Media. Go check out assignedmedia.com. We're going to take a break. When we come back, I've got my news bites for you, and I got one humdinger. So we'll be back in a second. You're listening to me, Ellie Krug. I'm the Illegal Trans Woman. And we're back. The Illegal Trans Woman. Evan Urquhart, I think he's going to become a regular contributor on this show. Check out Assigned Media. He's got wonderful takes on things affecting and involving the trans community. Okay. All right. News bites. I got two of them. We got 4 minutes and 30 seconds to get you both. News bite number one, as reported by Sharon Zhang on Truthout on Thursday, there was a White House conference on, quote, political terrorism. It didn't get much press, in part because you had the Todd Blanche hearings going on. You had a bunch of other things going on. You got the prep for what was a bust of a political speech by Trump on Thursday night. But this conference was going on, and there were people from multiple nations across the world. And it was an incredibly important conference for the transgender community, particularly for activists like me, okay? Because Stephen Miller spoke at that conference. So did little, Rubio, all right? But Stephen Miller in particular spoke out. He spoke about the National Security Presidential Memo, the NSPM, number 7, something that I've talked about before. That NSPM is aimed at, quote, disrupting, arresting, defunding, identifying, and prosecuting political terrorists, unquote. Miller called left-wing groups enemies of civilization. I mean, all the phrase they're just using is left-wing groups, okay? And he said that left-wing groups were enemies of civilization bent on destroying society. Marco Rubio stated that radical leftism is, quote, poisonous resentment cloaked in the language of equality, justice, and liberation, unquote. Can you believe? I mean, you talk about the need to be fair, the need for equality, the need for inclusion of other people. Apparently, that is political terrorism, according to this administration. And as I said, I've talked about NSPM 7 before because it lists various forms of terroristic behavior, such things as anti-Americanism, I'm reading from it, okay, anti-capitalism, and, quote, extremism on migration, race, and gender, unquote. That's where the trans thing comes in. Extremism on gender. Clearly, this conference and what Miller, God, the sociopath, and what Rubio, who turned, don't get me started, okay? What they're signaling, all right, is there going to be a crackdown. And I think it's coming quickly. And so that doesn't mean I'm going to quit doing what I'm doing. I mean, I'm not going to do that. I will persist. But I'll keep you advised. Keep tuned. Okay. Second news bite. As reported by John Russell in LGBTQ Nation, the organization GLAAD, it's a queer rights organization, GLAAD is one of the most famous and noteworthy in the country, issued its annual list of where are we in film for LGBTQ plus characters. Okay, the list is titled Where Are We in Film? It covers major studios like MGM Studios and streaming services like Netflix and Amazon. What they do is they go analyze, films. What they did is they analyzed 225 films. And what they found was 0 characters out of those 225 in the last year, 0 characters that were transgender. They found for LGBTQ plus characters that were in families or animated films, 0 of those characters. And out of 225 films, only 46 featured LGBTQ plus characters. They're forgetting that Generation Z, okay, that a quarter to a third of them are LGBTQ plus identifying, all right? If we're not in film, if trans people aren't in film, we don't exist. It's more about erasure, just like I talked with Evan. Not good. not good at all. And it's all about complying with Trump and MAGA. Got to take a break. When we come back, Random Acts. Ellie Krug here. And we're back. The illegal trans woman. All right, Random Acts. I've got a couple. All right. Number one, I've been talking about this road trip that I'm putting together, the Pacific Northwest. And it's like taking on a life of its own. So the trip is going to last 15 days. My poor boy Jack, going to go in the kennel for 15 days. I'm going to miss him, but they love him at the kennel. He loves being there. And so the trip's going to take me first through North Dakota. I'm going to stop at the Teddy Roosevelt, this new Teddy Roosevelt Library Museum. And then I'm going to end up going to Billings overnight, then to Yellowstone. I've never been to Yellowstone. I'm going to stay in the park overnight. And then it's going to be on to Idaho, where I'm going to, for a Lutheran Reconciling in Christ Church in Idaho Falls, I'm going to do gray area thinking, my human inclusivity talk. And then from there, I'm driving to Boise and speaking on the evening of one night at another Lutheran Reconciling Church doing gray area thinking. And then there is a human rights center in Boise called the Wasmuth Center, which looks like it is doing incredibly important work in such a red state. And I'm going to do gray area thinking for them in the morning, and then in the evening they want me to come back and do gleaning authenticity from a moment of truth. And I thought that that's where the speaking would end, and then the rest of the trip would just be pleasure. But no, it turned out my very, very dear friend Brian, who lives in Sonoma, California, north of Nampa, that he'd been talking me up. And it looks like he helped make a connection with a group called Sonoma Alive, I think. I may have that name wrong, but nonetheless, that group is going to sponsor me, and I'm going to do gray area thinking in Sonoma. Just thrilled about doing all of that speaking. That is important, of course, is because it helps to normalize the community. And it also helps, to teach people gray area thinking, gives people a tool set on how to be welcoming to people who are different or other. So I'm going to try and do at least one show from the road. We will see. But certainly I'll be talking about it. I'll be blogging about it. So just stay tuned. Item number 2, I took a piece of prairie behind my house, and it took 10 hours with a hand shovel to overturn dirt and make it into a garden patch. And I planted 4 pounds of wildflower seeds, and I am thrilled to report that finally, 2 months later, I'm starting to get some wildflowers. Not nearly as many as I want, but they're starting to pop up. And it makes my heart just sing when I see that. So I just thought I'd share that with you, because I am a planter. I am a grower. I believe in growing and nurturing living things. All right, with that note, I got to say thanks to my producer, Patrick, today. Patrick's done a great job. He always does. Listeners, between now and when you hear my voice next, please go out and do something good for another person as well as for yourself. Ellie Krug, over and out.